Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is titled, A Cult Based on Misinformation. The Washington Post has a headline, Planet is entering new climate regime with extraordinary heat waves intensified by global warming. The article has all sorts of hysterical claims about heat waves getting worse. I'm going to discuss two parts of it, the first one being record heat in India in June, and the other being the claim that last May was hottest on record in the United States. The first claim being that 118 degrees and 122 degrees in India in June is some sort of record. Had they done any actual research, they would have known that in June 1935, India reached 124 degrees. Thatch roofs ignited under the heat. Animals and birds were dying by the thousands. A temperature of 116 degrees was common over a wide area. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were below 310 parts per million at the time. Obviously, the heat has nothing to do with CO2 levels. Same story in 1953, 123 degrees in India in June. Scores of Indians are dying daily from sunstroke in a record heat wave. Sunstroke deaths in the past week were estimated above 400. And it wasn't just hot in June 1935. May 1935 also reached 122 degrees. Many people died. Villages became uninhabitable. In June 1966, India also reached 120 degrees and hundreds of people died in the heat wave. India is a very hot place and a very difficult place to live, and it always has been. When I was a child, half of the country was starving to death. There's no indication that heat waves are getting worse in India, and there's definitely no indication that carbon dioxide is affecting heat waves in India. But the claim I find really offensive is the one where they say the United States was hottest on record last May. Now I'm going to show you what's wrong with that claim. Last May was very warm in the United States due to a lack of cold fronts. The average maximum temperature was third highest on record in the United States after 1934 and 1936, but it was about 2 degrees cooler than May 1934. But instead of looking at the average maximum temperature, now let's look at the frequency of hot days. This graph shows the percent of May days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at all U.S. historical climatology network stations going back to 1895. The three hottest years were 1934, 1911, and 1962. Last year wasn't even in the top 10. And you can see that the trend line shown in red here is downward since the 19th century. It's much less likely that days in May will be over 90 degrees than they were 100 years ago. And for 95-degree days, last year barely made the top 15. There was about a third as many 95-degree days last year as there was in 1934. The heat of May 1934 was completely unprecedented. This is a temperature map of the United States on May 31, 1934. The red dots show places that were above 90 degrees, and the purple dots show places that were above 100 degrees. It was 108 degrees in Minnesota that day and 109 degrees in Iowa. May heat like 1934 is completely unprecedented, and last year there was no weather even vaguely resembling the heat of 1934. This was the U.S. Weather Bureau temperature anomaly map from May 1934. The whole country was extremely hot. It was 12 degrees above normal in the central parts of the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, last May was not a particularly hot month. It was a very warm month due to a lack of cold fronts. But there was not a lot of hot weather last May. Compare that to 1934, which was a very hot month. It was extremely hot. People were dying. Animals were dying. Farms were dying. The worst drought in the history of the United States was going on back then. These graphs are from the National Climate Assessment, and they show that heat waves in the United States have plummeted over the last century. The length of heat waves has declined, the magnitude of heat waves has declined sharply, and the warmest temperature has declined sharply too. This map shows in blue all the locations in the United States which don't get as warm as they used to prior to 1960. You can see that most of the U.S. does not get as hot as it used to. The Washington Post claims that heat waves are getting worse has no basis in science. And the United States statistics are very important because there's very little data outside of the United States. This map is from NOAA. It shows the locations where they have daily temperature data from prior to 1920. You can see that the United States has a lot of data, a little bit from Europe, a little bit from Australia, very little in the rest of the world. There's only a few places on Earth where we can calculate reliable heat wave data going back for a century. The United States has the vast majority of that data, And as the National Climate Assessment shows, heat waves have declined sharply in the United States. This graph plots the percent of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit versus atmospheric CO2 in the United States. The hottest weather in the United States occurred below 310 parts per million, and as CO2 has increased, the frequency of hot days has plummeted in the United States. The whole Washington Post article is based on junk science, bad statistics, and misinformation. But there's nothing new about that. The same thing was going on 150 years ago. Brisbane Courier, Tuesday, January 10, 1871, Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists, and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. The point being that people have been imagining that the climate's changing based on bad statistics for a very long time. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Heat waves are not getting worse. The National Climate Assessment clearly shows this. Heat waves used to be much worse in the past. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.